Hello, everyone. Happy Wednesday. Welcome to week 2 of the ABCs of Canadian Whiskey. We are joined, as always, by Gina and Ricky. Unfortunately, today, Dave was unable to join us, but he will be back next week. Today, we're talking all about Canadian whiskey production, from grain intake through distillation, all of the ins and outs. We're also joined by our 100 students in our 4th year of this program. So exciting stuff. Just like always, if you would prefer to interact and engage in Spanish, we have Ricky here. So you can just drop your questions, comments in the chat. We'll get them translated through Ricky and sent back to you. So we appreciate that, and we appreciate him. And then Gina Fawcett of Dandelion Bev Ed. She is talking us through everything we're learning today. So thank you all for joining us. We've already got some folks saying hello in the chat. Good to see you. When we get to the tasting, be sure to drop your tasting notes in there. That'll be a little later in the video. But without further ado, I will hand it over to Gina.
All right. Hello, everybody. Happy Wednesday. We are going to dive into Canadian whiskey production, just like Liz said. We're also going to get your questions in the chat as usual, but we're probably going to wait till the end because Dave is absent this week. So we're juggling all the questions and all the material. So stay with us. We'll get to your questions. Get them in the chat so that we have a full list of everything everyone wants to know. Okay, Canadian whiskey production. So this black and white photo is part of the Hiram Walker Distillery. And why I'm showing you this is because this is the distillery that the whiskeys we are tasting through are being produced from, but also this distillery is massive. It is a large operation, and it has the scope to really show you and take you inside and show you many different styles of Canadian whiskey being produced. So we're really able to show you a lot about the category from this one distillery. Today, we're going to take you from grain intake through milling that grain, making a grist, cooking, fermentation. Now we have a beer going into distillation. We're not going to get into maturation today. That's we're going to save that and blended whiskey for the next 2 weeks. But we will eventually get to maturation and blended whiskey as part of the production process. Now, Hiram Walker, again, we're using this distillery to show you scope of the category and the many different styles. And just to note that it is one of the largest distilleries in North America. So we have a little video to show you to give you the scope of what they do at Hiram Walker. give you some scope of the distillery, and you don't need to memorize those stats by any means, but just to kind of show you what you saw there, at Hiram Walker, they have 19 grain silos, and they're taking in 112,000 metric ton of corn a year. I know that video said 100,000, but updated figures give us 112. So increased production, around 10,000 metric ton of rye a year, and they are using hammer mill, which you'll see in a later video, going to work. When it comes to fermentation, there are 39 fermentation tanks. They all stand 4 stories high. You're going to get a look at those tanks later on in today as well. It's massive room. You can't possibly get them all in one shot. And then we're going to look at 3 different distillation styles of Canadian whiskey: single column distillation, double column distillation, and then a column still into a pot still separately. At Hiram Walker, they are producing around 180,000 liters of alcohol a day. And I know I said we weren't going into maturation, but one quick stat: they are aging 1.6 million barrels every single day at Hiram Walker. And then to blend or not to blend, right? Okay, so ingredients. Let's start at the beginning. The grains. So whether you're distilling corn, wheat, rye, barley, whatever grain you're going to make your whiskey out of, most of the time in Canadian whiskey production, not all of the time, it is not regulated that they do it this way, but most of the Canadian whiskey production is being produced, the Canadian whiskey, I should say, is being produced at 100% grain builds. So they take 100% corn, they mill that corn, they cook it, it goes through fermentation, distillation, into the barrel to age, and then they have a 100% corn whiskey. Same for wheat, same for rye, barley, etc. So now in the warehouse, there's all of these different barrels of corn whiskey, wheat whiskey, rye whiskey, etc. And then there's different types within those grains. So it could be aged in different types of barrels to give you many different types of corn whiskeys, distilled differently, fermented at different times, all kinds of variables that can happen through the process to produce a different flavor profile. And in the end, a different whiskey. This is why Canadian whiskey is so well known to be blended whiskey, because then after this production, they are blending the grain profiles, the whiskeys together to create their recipe, their grain recipe. That's not to say, like I said, it's not regulated. So it's not to say that people aren't doing mash bills. They certainly are. And Hiram Walker is building some mash bills as well. But all of their Canadian whiskey is coming out in this production style. And most of Canadian whiskey throughout the country is as well. Your larger producers certainly are producing this way. So taking a look at the grains, corn is going to give us the sweeter, creamier flavors to our whiskey, where wheat is going to imbue toasty, bready notes into the whiskey. Then we have rye that's going to give us that big, bold spice. And finally, barley giving us a little bit of a nuttiness. At Hiram Walker, they are going to source their grains as locally as possible. They do have a family of farmers they've worked with since the distillery opened in 1858. That farming business has been passed through generations, and they're still supplying the distillery with high quality grain. But that's not to say, saying source locally means a lot, to a lot of people. And it's certainly fun to say in your marketing, but it's also economical to get your grains as local as possible and not ship them clear across the country is more economical as well. However, this is not at the expense of the grain quality. So, what they can't control is the weather each year. And so if there is a bad weather year and the local grains are not coming to the quality standards that the distillery needs, they are going to look elsewhere. One example of this would be maybe, it's probably 5 or 6 years ago at this point, if I had to guess. It was a very, very wet season, and a lot of the rye especially, but a lot of the grain was coming in at much too high of a moisture level. Jasmine, which we'll talk about with Amy tomorrow for our students, was found in a lot of the grain, and a lot of it was rejected. And so they had to start sourcing outside their local Ontario sources. They went across the border to Michigan, some of which was actually closer in proximity to the distillery than the local Ontario farmers. But they did go outside, and they will reach outside for grain when needed, because they're not going to give up the quality standards for making the whiskey. So let's look at the grain coming in. This is a truck bed of corn, and you see this large probe here. That's going to go all the way down to the bottom. It's going to take different samples through the layers of the grain, and they're also going to do this toward the back of the truck. This is to get many different samples, making sure there's not faulty grain layered in somewhere. Once they get that sample, they're going to bring it inside to who we call the gatekeeper. Okay, this is Alice, who's in there on this video. But she's going to run a bunch of tests on this grain as quickly as she can, because they are just sitting there waiting on her. She's going to check kernel size, make sure it's consistent. If there's any foreign materials in the grain, moisture content. She's going to look how it grinds down or mills down into a grist, how soluble it is for cooking. She's even going to use her own human nose, without all the lab equipment, to really test whether there's a damp, kind of wet cardboardy smell or odor. That is an indication of jasmine, which you cannot get rid of through distillation, and that will be faulty whenever you decide to make that whiskey and age it. 10 years down the line aging, you have an entire wasted batch. So she would have to reject that batch right there. But once it gets accepted, then they're going to unload that corn right into those grates, and it's going to go into the silos by conveyor belt, which are kind of behind the truck. Okay, so the ingredients going into our pre-cook here are those grains, and then those grains, whichever one they're going to make the whiskey out of, is going to come to the hammer mill. So this is the hammer mill at Hiram Walker. It's going to grind it down to a really coarse, flour consistency that you can see there. They're also going to add enzymes. A lot of Canadian whiskey production, most of it, is going to have exogenous enzymes. And what this means is, enzymes that are not found in a malted grain like malted barley. Okay, this is because they're doing 100% corn, 100% rye, what have you. They need the enzymes, and we'll talk about that a little bit later, but they need the enzymes to break down the starch strains and make them more digestible for the yeast to produce alcohol. So the enzymes are very important, and they're most likely going to be using exogenous enzymes unless they're doing a malted barley whiskey here. Water goes in. The water at the Hiram Walker Distillery comes from the Great Lakes watershed, because they are right on Windsor at that southern tip there. And then backstillage, or sour mash, or some people might call it backset. But this typically goes in a cook. This is going to balance the pH levels where you want them to be. What this is kind of the sludge at the bottom of the still after distillation. You've taken the alcohol off as much as you can, and you've got this sludge at the bottom left over. Well, a little bit of that is going to go into the next batch. Again, to kind of balance out those pH levels where you want them to be, but also to make it more consistent from batch to batch, right? It also saves a lot of energy, because that stuff is hot. So when we are cooking and heating up at the very beginning of this process, if you're putting in a very hot liquid, that's going to help get this process going. Okay. And then nitrogen. And a lot of people don't like to talk about nitrogen being added through the process. Not sure why. But nitrogen does go in at the cook and during fermentation at different times. And what this does is really eventually help the yeast to grow and maximize their potential. It's a lot like putting nitrogen on your lawn, like fertilizer, to grow your grass faster and bigger and fuller. Same effects happening here. And they're definitely using this this process at Hiram Walker. So now we've got a mash, okay? So just kind of looking at the distillery, you know, all the piping that all of this is going into, it's going to go into the premix tank before we heat it up and cook it. We're just going to kind of get it all worked together first. That's going to move through all of these pipes to the batch cookers. Now, the camera here is going over the top and the back of these batch cookers, but it's going to come down to the front so you get a front view as well. These are massive cookers, you know, cooking these batches of mash. What they're going to have is mash after this to go to fermentation. Okay, cooking and fermentation. So let's look at what's actually happening here. On the left side, I was lucky enough to steal these from Dr. Don, the master blender at Hiram Walker. These are images of starch under a microscope. So starting at 67 degrees Celsius, as it heats up, it's going to swell. It's going to expand, okay? And then it's eventually going to kind of pop open. And now here's where the enzymes can go to work and break down these very large starch strains into sugars, very digestible units for the yeast, because the yeast is going to basically eat and digest these sugar units and these molecules, and then they can produce alcohol. That gives them the energy, the growth to multiply, etc. But if we give them something too large, they cannot digest it and they'll just die off. So we're going into fermentation. Here's that footage of the tops of the fermentation tanks. Like I said, impossible at Hiram Walker to get them all in one shot, but these are the tops of those 39. And now we're at the bottom looking up. So these things stand 4 stories high. They are massive. But this is where all of the fermentation takes place. This is where the yeast is going to be added, okay? So adding the yeast, which they're going to do right there. This is a powdered commercial yeast going in this fermentation tank. The yeast then are going to start to digest, eat the sugar molecules, multiply. They're going to let out carbon dioxide, alcohol, heat, but also they produce a lot of flavor. This is where we really start to produce a lot of flavor to our whiskeys. They're going to give fruity notes, floral, green grassy, soapy, sulfury notes, okay? And there's Amy, who is the director of distilling at Hiram Walker. Our 100 students will meet her tomorrow in our workshop session, but she's pulling a sample out there, and you can see it's very foamy, right? As the yeast gets to work, it foams up and it's hot and it foams up like that. So this is the beer that she's pulling out. That's what a distiller's beer is going to look like after fermentation. And that's what we're going to take to distillation next. Okay, so let's talk about distillation. We're going to talk about 3 styles, like I said. First up is single column distillation. So the column still at Hiram Walker, as you see right there, it's 5 stories high, massive. You can't get this thing in one shot. But it is made of copper, 100% copper. It is wrapped in insulation. It looks like it's stainless steel around the outside, but it's not. It's actually 100% copper outside, inside. It's just wrapped in insulation because that thing gets really hot. This is a section of that still. You can see all of these little round doors, right, into the still. At each one of these doors, there is a top and bottom kind of floor. There's plates, okay, inside the still. And these plates have little holes in them, okay? These are sieve plates. What's going to happen is your beer is going to go in toward the top. Your steam, your heat source, is going to go in at the bottom. The steam's going to work its way up through the plates. The beer is going to work its way down. The temperatures are different from bottom to top. Of course, the further away we get from that steam input, the cooler it will get. At different temperatures, we're going to get different flavors. It's like a mini distillation happening at each plate through this still, okay? So the beer goes down, the steam comes up. And in this next video, you can see Amy here. She's actually going to open one of these doors up to see inside the still, and you can see these sieve plates here. There's actually a day they were cleaning the still that they shot this video, as luck would have it. But there's the plate with all the tiny little holes, right? So the beer is going to work its way down, steam up, and we're going to have distillation happening, more alcohol coming up as it rises, okay? Lots of reflux in these things. So copper, I talked about copper. This is 100% copper. Why is copper important? Copper absorbs sulfur. It becomes copper sulfate, which is why the still needs to be cleaned, because that copper sulfate needs to be taken off eventually. But the copper is going to take out those sulfur notes that the yeast created. We don't want sulfur in our whiskey. Nobody wants to drink that. Yuck, right? So we need to get rid of that. And stills, you know, all over the place. Stills are made of many different types of materials. Some have a little bit of copper. Some have a ton of copper, like this is 100% copper. Some people will put copper pads in the still. The more copper you have, the more sulfur removal you have during distillation, okay? So you're going to end up here with a full-bodied whiskey, retaining the grain character, nice big grainy whiskey, retaining most of your yeast character, not all of it. You're going to retain your fruity notes, your floral, any green, grassy notes, soapy notes, but you don't see sulfur listed there. Hopefully, at Hiram Walker, the way they distill everything, hopefully they've gotten rid of those sulfur notes here. And it's coming up to about 70% ABV on this distillation. Okay, so now double column distillation. We start in that first beer still that we just looked at, and then we take that condensed down liquid, we take it to a second column still. This thing is even larger. It is 5 stories high, but it is a bigger diameter. And you can see there, they actually did get a shot of the entire still. But what's going to happen now in this second column distillation is now we're starting to strip that grain character away. Now we're starting to strip the yeast flavors away. We're going to end up with a very light style whiskey. You're going to have a hint of the grain, a hint of the yeast, but I mean, it is super light in style. All whiskeys coming off the still, water white, okay, here, or clear, water white. But very light. There's Dr. John Livermore, the master blender. A lot of Canadian whiskey companies will use this style for their base whiskey in their blends, kind of the glue that holds these big flavored whiskeys together. But they can also be aged a certain way to really shine on their own as well. So again, we're stripping grain character here. We're stripping yeast character. We're actually coming up to 94, 95% ABV. I mean, we're almost at vodka level. Very close, okay? So we're not neutral, but it's pretty close to a neutral spirit there. Okay, now we're going to talk about going into a pot still. So back up to that column still, This one right here is actually a hybrid still. It's a pot on the bottom and a column on the top. But this is what they're mostly doing in Highmarker. That first beer still again into their lot 40 pot still. Any of their pot still whiskeys is going to be made in this pot still. It's a 12,000 liter still. They're doing 8,000 liter batches, and they're very slow distillation process. We'll talk about in a minute. These are some old gin stills at the distillery that Dr. Don there is going to open up just to show you the bottom. This heat source is very different. This is a coiled heat source, so it's a direct heat at the bottom of that still. So this lot 40 still you can see there, like I said, 8,000 liter batches. They're going to distill very slowly. It's a 12-hour distillation. Now, to put that in perspective, if you look at single malt scotch and how that is distilled, one pot distillation on a single malt scotch, depending on the distillery, they all have their own styles, of course, and ways of doing things. But you're looking at somewhere generally between 4 and maybe 8 hours. Highmarker is really slowing this process down by keeping more consistent temperature levels, letting the vapors come off the liquid, evaporate off slowly. And this way they can make more accurate cut points on the liquid. So at Highmarker, they're using this pot distillation to make cut points and really concentrate the flavor notes that they want to concentrate up. At different temperatures, you're going to capture different congeners, different odors, different flavors. And you can see here, starts out very grassy, green notes and starts to go into fruity notes and then floral. And this is actually a chart for lot 40. So spice is coming from the grain. That would be different if it was corn. And then soapier notes in the tails. And they're going to discard those green grass and soapy notes for lot 40 specifically, which we're going to talk about later when we do our tasting. So like I said, we're going to concentrate specific flavors by making cut points at Highmarker with the pot still, and they're going to take that 70% ABV from the beer still. It's going to come up now to about 80% ABV from the pot still. Okay, and just a fun visual. Okay, just to have some fun. When we talk about recipe creation, and like I said, this is not regulated in Canada that they do it this way. This is just the way that most of Canadian whiskey is produced. But we're really looking at that grain recipe being created after maturation. Whereas if we're comparing to the US or American whiskeys, generally speaking, especially if we're looking at bourbon or rye, we're going to look at recipe creation happening actually at the beginning of that production, making a mash bill. They're blending their grains to make a flavor profile and then putting that mash bill through the whole process to create their whiskey. So some examples here, you might see corn, rye, wheat, each at 100% going into a bottle, into a blend. You might just see 100% rye. That's okay too. They don't have to blend. Or you might see a very layered and complex blend like this one, which is corn, 2 different rye whiskeys, 2 different wheat whiskeys, 2 different barley whiskeys. And there's different distillation styles here, different maturations on those to really give lots of layer of flavor there. And just an example, in the US, you typically might see the same mash bill being aged in different parts of the warehouse maybe, but then those barrels being mingled in American whiskey, is what we like to say, mingled or blended to create a bottling there. Okay, so we are going to head into the tasting today. We're going to taste J.P. Weiser's 18-year-old and lot number 40. So if you have a tasting kit, make sure you have those whiskeys out. If you don't have a tasting kit, it'd be great if you would just happen to have those bottles at home. If you don't, follow along with us, and you can run out and get them as soon as you can. Also, if you have a tasting kit, get your tasting booklet out, make some notes. We are in the production section, okay? Okay, so first up is JP Weiser's 18-year-old. Okay, so pick up that glass and just start to nose it as I'm talking about it. So when we look at this whiskey, this is 100% corn. I'm really trying to show you this 100% grain build this week, okay? So this is 100% corn. It is double column distilled, that very light style, and it's aged in multiple use Canadian whiskey barrels, meaning those barrels are used over and over and over until they fall apart. Now, the reasoning for this is to show off that light style of whiskey, but also to show off what's happening during maturation, because there's very little wood influence happening here. There's some, but it's little. And they're really showing off the ethyl acetate development that we're going to talk about in depth next week. But what that means is it's developing through time. The longer it's in the warehouse, 18 years, through time, it's going to develop some bright green apple, very bright notes of green apple fruitiness. So on the nose here, I mean, I get vanilla and cornflakes every time. Frosted Flakes, vanilla and cornflakes, a little bit of fruitiness as well, but honestly, the corn on the nose actually stands out to me more than I would suspect for a very light style whiskey. Go ahead and take a sip. Still very light. It's 40% ABV. Still very light in style. But those apple notes really start to come forward. It's kind of like a caramel apple. Dave and I always talk about that. But a green caramel apple, tart. Yes, I see somebody said tart. I totally agree with a little bit of tartness on those apple notes there. So this is a really great example of that 100% grain build, that production style in Canada, distillation style, double column distillation. And then when we get into maturation next week a little bit more, we'll talk about this more in depth, but just using a multiple used barrel over and over and over. So very little wood extract there, giving those nice bright notes to the whiskey. Okay, so then we're going to move on to lot number 40. And if you do have your tasting booklet in front of you, I'm flipping open here. Here we go. Take a look at this polar histogram. It's wild. I mean, if you don't know what you're looking at, you're like, maybe it's wild. I don't know, but I think it's wild. If you look at the grain, that rye is like, boom, that's huge. That is a huge measurement of rye there, right? Also cask. So let's talk about this whiskey. Why are these things standing out so much? This is 100% rye whiskey, okay? So again, another really great example of this Canadian whiskey style and production style of making things at 100% grain build. We have 100% rye. Now, a different distillation style here that we just talked about. First, that column still, that single column. We've retained our grain. We've retained our yeast notes. We're going into the pot still now, that very slow pot distillation to make our cut points and concentrate the flavor. And that rye, really concentrated there. Okay. And then it's going into brand new American oak, number 2 char barrels. Brand new number 2 char barrels, again, we'll get into this more in depth next week, is going to give you a lot of wood extract. So you're getting really nice notes of spice from the grain, caramel, vanilla from the wood. Let's go ahead and nose this, taste this. I mean, this is big, bold, but it does have a nice sweetness, you know, a nice kind of coating of the back. You really feel the warmth in your chest from the rye. Dr. Don likes to call that the Canadian hug. But, you know, you feel that warmth, but you also get a nice finish. It's a long finish. This works wonderfully in cocktails. We had a cocktail session last week. Kate Bushel made a wonderful punch with Lot 40. So this is a really great example, completely different style of whiskey, but both of them really showing off that 100% grain build production style. Okay. Okay, so let's see if there are any questions. I think, Liz, you are silent in my ears.
I sure was. I did mark a couple for us here. This was one of them.
Okay,
This
does
one
all
always
this
comes
happen?
up. Yeah, I think that every year they find it so interesting that it's kind of just tested by the nose. So this always.
Yes. So I think, Sean, you're talking about like the quality tests, right? That in that video that Alice was doing. Do all of those quality checks happen before that truck is unloaded? Yes. Now she's doing them as quickly as possible because they are waiting. She is standing behind bulletproof glass because those truckloads equal a lot of money for a farmer, and that is how they make a living, right? And it can become slightly heated. So yes, it does happen, and they are not afraid to turn them away when they need to. Some years they don't have to turn many away, and we'll talk to Amy tomorrow, who is the director of distilling, because she does oversee that crew. And some years, the very wet year, I think they told me it was like almost 40% rejection rate, which is nuts.
Mm-hmm.
I would not have wanted that job that year. But yeah, they do reject them. Now, the good thing about it is there is an ethanol plant right down the road. They don't get the same prices for that grain. So ideally, they want to sell it to Hiram Walker. But if it does get rejected, they can go down to the ethanol plant because, you know, we don't care what our gas tastes like.
We've got a couple more that came in from Nora here.
Okay, how does it end up in the grains? I'm not sure what you're referring to. Maybe like the any faulty grains, or how does like jasmine? There's lots of different toxins that can come into the grain, and Amy's going to get in depth about this tomorrow. Amy Levesque, who was in those videos, she's going to get into crazy depth about a lot of this, but you know, it depends what it is. But there's vomitoxin, there's jasmine, there's lots of different ways that the grain can be infected, and it would infect the quality of the whiskey. One way is that it's a very wet, damp season. This can happen also in the silos. If there's moisture in the silos, then it can develop some sort of infection, lots of different things can occur that would make the grain faulty and we couldn't use it. So, you know, just maintaining the silos alone is a huge undertaking.
Okay, I got a little more clarity. So Quincy asked, what makes the jasmine spoil the corn? And then Nora was asking about just that.
Okay. And the way that I'm saying it, it does sound like jasmine, but it's geosmin. It starts with a G, Geosmin. Anyways, what makes it spoil the corn? So I think this is a question for Amy tomorrow because she's going to cover this in depth, and this is her specialty. A little bit beyond my expertise of exactly what's happening there from a damp environment to the geosmin development there. But we can certainly dive in with Amy tomorrow to ask her, and all learn something new.
Absolutely. She has a wealth of knowledge.
Mm-hmm.
A couple more here.
Pre-modern science. Okay, measuring cut points pre-modern science. There are tons of tools now. This is one that I know Amy's going to touch on tomorrow as well, but one thing she'll say is when she's making a new whiskey or experimenting with a new flavor profile, especially if she's experimenting with a mash bill or something, any new spirit, I think she does this with, but she actually takes a sample. I think it's every 15 minutes. It's either 10 or 15, but she takes a sample no matter what, every 10 or 15 minutes on the first run. And then she has a whole lineup of exactly what congeners, what things smell like, taste like, what's in every timed point. You can go by temperature, but then the environment is also, and the air pressure is also going to affect that in some ways. So to be super consistent, she actually goes by timing to really measure where those cut points are going to be. And that's what she suggests anyways. And that's not really using super modern tools. That's using a watch, a stopwatch. To pull samples and then decide where the cut points are being made. So there's lots of ways to do it, though, and different distilleries certainly use different techniques for that.
Yeah. I think a lot of these, like you've already said, Amy's definitely touching on tomorrow. Mm-hmm. Got one from Lacey that just came in.
In between arrow denoted as grist. What was that referring to? Oh, that's a great question. So the grist is when you take the grain from the silos, full kernels of grain of, let's say, corn, full kernels of corn. They come up to the hammer mill. They get ground down into that coarse like flour. That is called a grist. So once it's milled, it's still dried. It's going to go into the pre-mix tank with the other ingredients, water, enzymes, nitrogen, etc. But the grist is actually the grain after it's ground down.
Alrighty. Got another one from Kristen.
Ooh, average shelf life for the grains. At Hiram Walker, I think they're using them within 3 days. Now, they do have to store them over the winter, so that is different. But in the summertime, when there is more humidity and moisture that can overtake it, they're really going through that grain very quickly, okay? They're trying to use it before it could have any spoilage or any infection of any kind. It does have time to go bad, certainly, and the longer it sits there, the more risk there is to any of that. But it at Hiram Walker, that they're making so much alcohol and so much whiskey that they're really running through it pretty quickly.
Alrighty. This one was from Joe from a while back.
Scalding the distillate. The backset scalding the distillate. The backset's actually going in before there is a distillate. So it's going in that pre-mix tank and the cook to help things really get started. As far as like energy to help it start to get heated up, there is a danger or risk to the enzymes. If they get too hot, they're useless. They're dead. So you can't overheat the enzymes, and you have to be very careful at when you're putting certain things in, so something doesn't go massively hot very quickly. you really do have to control the rise of that temperature. So depending how much is going in with the water, it's not going to be just back set. It's just a little bit into the batch. A little goes a long way.
Okay, and then another from Jennifer. This is from a little earlier too.
Started to show smoke taint from the wildfires. I have no idea. I would guess no. I would guess that is not something that they're too concerned about, but that is a guess. So let's ask Amy tomorrow. She will have insider information to share.
Definitely. Let's see. I know I missed a few here. There's one from Kaz.
Why do we think people avoid talking about nitrogen? I don't know. There's like a bad rap about it. And I honestly, no one at Hiram Walker has ever not talked about it to me. But I've been at other distilleries where they won't mention it at all. Now, some distilleries don't use it, but a lot of people are using it. And so I don't know why it's not really included as part of the ingredients, because it is something that is being added. And, you know, full disclosure is a good thing.
And then speaking of the nitrogen, we've got one here.
How is it added in solid form? No, it's not solid form. It's a gas. Yeah, it's a gas. We'll double check that with Amy. I've never actually seen it, seen this part of the process, but we will double check that with her, but I'm pretty sure it's a gas.
Yeah. Awesome. I think we've caught them all. There's some nitrogen discussion in the chat, but yeah, we'll talk more about that tomorrow with Amy.
Yeah.
Well, thank you all so much for joining us today. I think we'll be able to give you a little time back. We missed Dave, but like I said, we should have him back next week. And we'll see all of you next week for week 3. Almost halfway there. So that's pretty cool. Students, we'll see you tomorrow on the workshop with Amy from 3 to 5 Eastern. Ricky, Gina, thank you all so much. And then everyone else, we'll see you back here next week. Same time, same place.
Sounds great. Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye, everyone.